Good evening, and welcome to this Friends at Home event, sponsored by the Friends of Alameda Free Library. Tonight, we will be talking with Daniel Olivas about his collection of short stories, How to Date a Flying Mexican. We are delighted also to welcome Leon Salvatierra, an award-winning poet originally from Nicaragua. He is currently teaching culture and literature at UC Davis, making him the perfect person to interview Danielle. I am T.C. Curry from the Friends of the Alameda Library, a nonprofit organization raising funds and advocating for our outstanding public library in the beautiful city of Alameda, California. These events are free, but you won't be surprised to learn that we appreciate donations. A little later, you will see a link for donations in the chat. And any donations, large or small, will support these virtual events, as well as many programs conducted at the library in real life. Before we get started, you should know this is a live webinar. It's being recorded and will later be posted on YouTube. So your microphones and your cameras are turned off. Please use the chat to introduce yourself, let us know where you're calling from, and also to ask questions. We have time scheduled for the Q&A at the end of the interview, and we will do our best to get to all of your questions. Closed captioning is available by clicking the icon at the bottom of your PC or laptop screen. If you are on a tablet, it's already on. We ask, as you use the chat, to make sure that it is being used respectfully. We will cut off anyone who is disrespectful. So, enough mechanics, let's move on. Tonight's book, which I really enjoyed reading, is called How to Date a Flying Mexican. It's a collection of short stories derived from Chicano and Mexican culture, ranging through fascinating literary worlds of magical realism, fairy tales, and fractured futures. Daniel Olivas, is the grandson of Mexican immigrants and was born and raised near downtown Los Angeles. He's an award-winning author of fiction, nonfiction, plays, and poetry. Widely anthologized, Danielle has written on culture and literature for a broad range of publications, including the New York Times, Los Angeles Review of Books, BOMB, B-O-M-B, the Jewish Journal, High Country News, and The Guardian. He writes regularly for the Blogger, an online literary site dedicated to Latinx culture and the arts. By day, he is a senior attorney at the California Department of Justice and makes his home in Southern California. Please join me in welcoming Daniel Olivas to our program. Danielle and Leon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for the beautiful, beautiful introduction, TC, and many thanks to the Friends of the Alameda Free Library.
Thank you. Again, thank you, all of you, for being here, and thank to the Friends of the Alameda Free Library for hosting this event. I'm honored to be part of this event, and because I admire the work of Danielle, and I also enjoy sharing our our work with the community. So thank you for being here, and I look forward to our conversation today. So I guess, is it time to start now? Okay. So before I actually begin my conversation with Daniel Olivas, who is a Chicano author who, like I said, I admire a lot, and I'm honored to be interviewing him today. I want to share a couple of comments that have to do with what I experienced while reading this wonderful book of short stories, How to Date a Flying Mexican. And I hope that my comments will lay the foundation for our conversation, will give us a range of topics that will later explore with Daniel. And I'll try to be as brief as I can. So before I read the actual stories, when I looked at the book and I had it in my hands, and I looked at the title, How to Date a Flying Mexican, it made me think of two aspects of literature. The first, in particular to Chicanx literature, the first one was humor. And the second one, which is not particular to Chicanx literature, but Latin American literature, is magical realism. And I will talk about humor first. I found throughout the years of my reading Chicanx literature and teaching Chicanx literature as well, that humor is an integral part of the culture and the literary identity of Chicanx culture. So, and this is one of the things that I admired the most about Chicanx literature. It's humor. And I'm not here to say that there's no humor in other literary traditions. Of course there is. But it seems to me, and this is just my opinion, that humor is a constant in Chicanx literature. And it's become part of its fabric, its identity. And you know, I've asked friends of mine who are poets and Chicana authors, and I asked them, why is that? Why is humor such a big part of the culture and the literature? And they often say that, well, you know, it's a community that have overcome a lot, that had to face a lot of adversity, that had to face a lot of struggles, and humor is a mechanism to kind of like deal with that, and that makes sense. But I think there's something more to that had to do with the weaving of the stories. And I remember an interview that I saw a video of Luis Valdez, who is the creator of Teatro Campesino, and he was talking about, you know, how at the height of the Chicano movement, it was important to bring theater to the farm workers. But, you know, there was the thing about this was that a lot of the farm workers had never been exposed to theater. And how were they going to bring theater? So they decided to make it entertaining. So they took humor and as a literary device to create a delight for the consumption of theater. And I think now humor is a central part of the culture. And this is one of the things that I admire about this book, because I found myself laughing as I read through the stories. The other part has to do with magical realism. You know, the title, The Flying Mexican, made me think of course, of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude, the iconographic novel. But then as I read through the stories, I realized that it wasn't magical realism. It was just magical. And I'm not using the word magical in the sense of, oh, it's a wonderful book, which of course it is. But I'm using the word magical in the sense that of magic, right? And I will make the distinction. In magical realism, in the books of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, what gets treated as magic is not actually the magic itself, but it's stuff that comes from the advancement of technology. For example, the memorable first line of 100 Years of Solitude, where it says the Colonel Jose Arcadio Buendia would would always remember, as he faced the firing squad that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover the ice, which of course the ice was produced by the fridge. And so that was what was magical for the characters in 100 Years of Solitude. But when Remedios La Bella went up into the sky and never came back, that was kind of like not, that was part of the natural world in 100 Years of Solitude. And so that was treated as something common, not out of the norm. But in How to Date a Flying Mexican, magic is treated as something out of the norm. And I want to underline that because I think, as much as I admire magical realism, I think this approach to magic is much truthful to our cultural reality, because magic in the Chicanx culture and also in the Latinx culture in Latin America is central to our cultural experience. We talk about ghosts, we talk about curanderas and so forth. And so we're talking about magic, it's not part of their natural world, it's part of the supernatural world, and we treat it as such. And that's and I'm grateful that this book treats magic as magic. So with that, I want to go into my conversation with Danielle. I was trying to be as brief as I could, but these things sometimes take a little bit to explain. Hi, Danielle. How are you doing?
Fine. I appreciate that analysis and your kind comments. And I think it's clear to the audience that you are a professor. You're very intellectual, and you dig deep into the nuances of literature. But before I start to respond, I need to do one quick shout out to very special guests who are watching. Girl Scout Troop 6665 of Redondo Beach, and Michelle Burkhart and the other Den mothers who actually had me as a guest last week. Though they didn't ask me questions like you just asked me. They asked me other very interesting questions. Let me address both aspects, because you talk about humor and you also talk about magic as opposed to magical realism. I do agree with people like Luis Valdez and other writers that the humor I use, does grow out of a defense mechanism in some ways. If you can laugh at something, it becomes less frightening. In some ways, Dia de los Muertos and some of the iconic images created by the great artist Jose Guadalupe Posada, the calacas, the skeletons dressed up in outrageous outfits and doing outrageous things, by looking at death, for example, with a humorous lens. It makes death a little easier to deal with. Also, I think within the culture there is a strong sense of the absurd. We observe and we see the absurdity in our society, in our religions, in our daily lives, and that absurdity can be a perfect basis for writing or creating humorous tales. The magic that I use when I create, and we've talked about this before, you and I don't think intellectually about the story I'm creating. The stories I create come from a very deep and almost subconscious place in my mind, and I very seldom think, okay, I'm going to make someone levitate, and that's going to be a symbol for this. or I'm going to have the grandmother appear as a ghost, and she's going to be smoking a fat cigarette and drinking coffee and interfering with her family, and that's going to be a symbol for that. I don't do that. I simply tell stories. In some ways, it's sort of like the oral tradition that I grew up with, the Chicano and tradition of telling stories, and telling stories that maintain an interest in what you're trying to express, and stories that sometimes have a truth to them that are a truth that is masked, if you will, by magic or the supernatural, or perhaps an absurd viewpoint. In one of my stories, the title story, in fact, there is a ghost who reappears throughout How to Date a Flying Mexican. The short story basically is about a woman named Conchita. She's in her 60s, and she does not follow tradition. She's not married. She loves to go on many different dates, and she eventually falls in love with a man who can levitate, a widower who's about her age. And at one point, when she is in bed with her new boyfriend, and he's fallen asleep, her mother appears, and she's smoking her big fat cigarette and drinking coffee, and she starts to question Conchita about this brand new man of hers. And one of the things that occurs is when that grandmother, Belen, is about to disappear, Moises, the boyfriend, wakes up and he smells the smoke. Even though this ghost has appeared and is smoking, the smoke is real. And Moises asks, "Have you been smoking?" And Conchita says, "No, no, no," and pats him back to sleep. And so the intersection between the two worlds, between the supernatural, the other world, and our physical world, it's separated by a very sheer curtain. And that's certainly how I was raised, within my family and within my community, which is predominantly Mexican American or Latin American immigrant community in LA. Those types of beliefs and stories were constant type of backdrop for us. At bedtime, my late father would sometimes read to me a book called Lies of the Saints. And there were horrific stories, frightening stories where like the devil is shaking the bed of a saint or other horrible things. And he's reading these stories. I was like, 4 years old. So those stories, kind of made their way into me and became about pretty much, the tapestry from which I draw my stories from. I don't know if I answered your questions, but
yeah, no, you did great. I was thinking as you were speaking about the wonderful example you brought up in How to Date a Flying Mexican, when the dead mother shows up smoking a cigarette, right? And Moises wakes up and he's still able to smoke the cigarette. It's like it makes me think of the cigarette itself. It's part of, even though it's a dead person smoking that cigarette, it makes it into our world. So there's this overlap, like you said, this overlap of the supernatural world and our world, the world of the living, and it's this cigarette that is kind of like the materiality of the dead, what I would say, right? Is what is the evidence that we, because if we didn't have the smoke, if we didn't have Moises saying, "Oh, have you been smoking?" then we could think, "Oh, maybe Conchita is a schizophrenic and she talks to people," right? But the fact that Moises is able to smell the cigarette, it it just proves that that there is this overlap of, and it makes me think of other writers like Borges. Sometimes Borges will have these fantastic stories where he creates a parallel world, right? A parallel, kind of like parallel universe together, and there's these moments of overlap, and that's where the what we call fantastic literature appears, you know, and you know, and the same thing with other examples. I mean, Gabriel Garcia Marquez uses that, and many, and that's really a big part of the Latin American tradition, literary tradition. So following that, I was thinking, you know, if you talk about magic, and have you had any influences from writers from Latin America with respect to this, to the way you treat magic or in your work?
Well, certainly Garcia Marquez is one of the primary influences. But if you want to trace the concept of magic or magical realism back farther back, say to Franz Kafka, and the fantastical stories that he told, Metamorphosis is probably the most famous. That I actually have a story in this collection, Franz Kafka in Fresno.
In Fresno, yeah, that's what I was going to say.
And there, in some ways, what I enjoy doing sometimes is drawing upon not only upon the literary traditions of Latin America and Mexico, but also literary traditions of other countries, and Franz Kafka certainly falls within that. And in that story, in truth, when you read that story, nothing magical ever happens. It's a little strange, it's a little bizarre. There are some characters. There's a giant, meaning a very tall person, who appears, and there is in fact an insect that poet Franz, my half German, half Chicano character, encounters, and he doesn't like vermin, and that's just, of course, harking back to Metamorphosis. When I was very, very young, one of my favorite authors was Lewis Carroll, you know, Through the Looking Glass and Alice in Wonderland, and I also loved The Wizard of Oz. So those stories have a magical element to them, that can be read on different levels, you know, for children and then for adults. I did read, it's funny, I read an analysis of my fiction by a professor, Frederick Aldama, who is a professor who was at Ohio State at the time. I think he's at he's in Texas now, I believe. He indicated that my magical realism was part of a new wave of magical realism where I was making fun of magical realism, which is interesting. I never imagined myself making fun of the tradition, but maybe my approach does turn it a bit on its head, and maybe that's something that you were alluding to in some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I explained it. To me, it's not magical realism. To me, it's just magical. But that's just my personal opinion. But I wanted, because this is a wonderful book, and it's important for people to know, like, how this book was put together. And I wanted to know, I know that some of the stories, I mean, I think all of the stories were placed in different outlets and different venues at different time periods, and then you put the book together. So I was wondering, how was the process? Was that something? Did you have a book manuscript originally, and then you started placing the pieces here and there, or was this something that happened afterwards? Was it like, you realize, oh, I published so many short stories, and they have some sort of literary cohesiveness or intertextuality, because that's one of the things that I admire about the book, that some of the pieces talk about other pieces, like other characters in other stories. Like, for example, Tina's Cafe reappears, or La Diabla reappears as a character. And so I was wondering how the process of creating this book, how was it? How did you put it together? Because it's one thing to read a short story in a magazine, and then the other thing is to read it in conversation, a collection, as a full collection of short stories.
Right. Let me answer that in a couple of different ways. First, your reference to the story "Good Things Happen in Tina's Cafe," that grew out of a group of friends in my day job at the Attorney General's office. And one of the attorneys had a coffee maker in her office. So we called it Tina's Cafe, and we'd go in there for a coffee break. And one day I told them a few years back, I'm gonna write a story, and it'll be called "Good Things Happen at Tina's Cafe," and I'm gonna put all of you in it. So actually, all their names are in the story. So I created that story. It gets published, and it was actually in a prior collection. But because I view my literary creations as one world, Tina's Cafe appears in a newer story that I wrote 10 years later, which appears in this book, in the story Los Otros Coyotes, which addresses the Trump administration's family separation policy. I mentioned Tina's Cafe as being physically on Spring Street, in the same place where it appeared 10 years ago in that other story. This collection is a little different from my other collections. Most collections that I have written, and I've now written 10 books, usually I will write a story, complete it, and send it off to a literary journal, and then it'll get published. And I'm just creating stories, and sometimes I create a certain number of stories. For example, my very first collection, Assumption and Other Stories, published in 2003 by Bilingual Press, all the stories in it are realistic stories. There's no magic whatsoever. And a lot of stories had to do with young Chicano kids in LA. So my first stories really was almost a recounting of my childhood and of my community as I was growing up. And once I had a series of stories, I felt like, oh, this is looking like a book, without previously intending it to be a book. Then I started to pull them together and try to see how they could fit together. Some of the magical stories I did write didn't fit with that first collection, so I kept them out. The next collection, Devil Talk, is filled with half magical realism and half realistic stories, but all the stories in that collection deal with the concept of evil and how we address evil in our lives. So sometimes when I'm creating books and collections, I don't know that I'm really going to be creating something specific. It's unlike a novel where I'm saying, okay, I'm going to write 50,000 words. I'm going to aim to write a novel that addresses basically several key characters. That's not what that's not how my collections work. Now, this collection was shaped differently. In 2020, when my father was coming near the end of his life, I would go visit my parents in Ventura, and I would sit and talk with my father. And my father never got published. He had always wanted to publish stories and poetry. He destroyed all his writing, and he focused on raising his family and getting educated. So when I started publishing, he was very proud, and he really loved this particular story, How to Date a Flying Mexican, which was part of a novel from 2011. And so we started talking about my writing career at that point, over 20 years of publishing. And it was during those conversations near the end of his life that I came up with the idea to choose some of my favorite stories and read the stories I had published throughout the two plus decades, and choose some of my favorite ones, and use that title story, the story that my dad loved so much, the one that made him laugh, as sort of like in a sense, the table setting for the rest of the book. And then I had written 2 brand new Trump-related stories dealing with his anti-immigrant policies, and I end the collection with those. So this book grew out of those conversations with my father, my late father, and also with maybe the solemnity, if you will, of the pandemic we're going through. I've been working at home for several years now because of the pandemic, and that can do something to you. And it can also, one of the things that I think the pandemic did to me, particularly as loved ones have passed away in the last several years, is make me face my mortality. And so I wanted to introduce new readers to the stories I had written, and then maybe remind my prior readers, what some of those stories may have been their favorite stories of mine, and then give them the treat of a couple brand new stories. So that's how this particular collection came to be.
Thank you. It's great that you mentioned your father, and I really, when you talk about your father in your introduction, it's I laughed the part where you talk about the title and how he found it comical and made him laugh, because without reading that, that was kind of like my experience, just like looking at the title, and made me laugh. And I guess like the thing about family, like family is central to most of these stories. A lot of the stories, like family is the nucleus of the narrative. And so I was wondering, how do you ever use your real family as a source of literary production? Or if not, not think of like family like that, but like maybe your memories. How do you, like, growing up as a child in a Chicano family, how do you use that? Like I think it was Vargas Llosa who said, writers only need to have good memories to be really good writers, because in my interpretation is that maybe because memory is always literary, because it's never fixed and it's never truthful, which is like, seems to me like the description of literature, right? And so so what do you think about that?
So I have very few stories where I actually modeled any of my characters on actual family members. I can think of one story in particular, with regard to a shooting at a Jewish day school that actually happened to my family. My son was attending the North Valley Jewish Community Center in 1999, when a white supremacist, Buford Furrow, shot it up. And we thought we had lost our son that day. It was hours before we were reunited with him. And so I wrote a short story. In real life, the shooter is serving a life sentence in federal prison. And in my story, the shooter gets killed by the police. And in some ways, I was working through the trauma of a hate crime through that story. And that story is called Summertime. Very simple title, Summertime. It kind of makes you think of a pleasant, nice, but it was not. It was a horrible summer for us and for the other families. There are many of the characters, I would say, are in fact composites of different bits and pieces people from my family or people from the community I grew up in, people I've known throughout life. And one of the things I am most proud of was when my mother once said, my mother and father are biggest fans of mine. So my mother, one point after reading one of my collections, said, you know, your fiction reads as if it were written in Spanish first and then translated into English. And I said, well, what do you mean? She said, there's just a music to it that sounds like it's based on you know, someone who speaks Spanish, which is ironic because I'm a pocho. I don't speak Spanish very well. When I was young, I had trouble with language. And so the doctors, I went in for testing and doctors told my parents to cut all Spanish in the house when I was 4 years old. So, and of course, that was the bigotry at the time of the 60s, which lasted, you know, into 70s and 80s and even 90s against Spanish speaking. And but so the music of the dialogue that I grew up listening to, you know, within the family, with my grandmother who was born in Mexico and the only grandparent I knew, and the community I grew up in, I think that is replicated in my fiction rather heavily, not necessarily, you know, particular people, but more the way the people I grew up with spoke and dealt with life through, you know, their language and how they described things and how they dealt with each other.
Well, that's really interesting because, you know, as I read through your stories, one of the things that I recognized right away was the narrative voice and how the stories, the narrator is so integral to the stories themselves, because I mean, when I think about the receptors or like the audience for these stories, I don't think of readers, I think of listeners, because the narrative voice is always, you know, it's this kind of narrator is deeply rooted in the Latin American tradition of el cuento del fogón, you know, which you typically have an elderly person around the fireplace talking about telling stories and to young people, and they're listening. And there's something beautiful about that kind of narrative. It's part of the aesthetic experience, just listening to someone talk about, tell a story, right? And so, you know, and so I was wondering about how you see the short story as an art form and how it relates to your cultural experience. And, you know, maybe you have already answered that question by what you said, but, you know, I wanted to maybe ask you to read a fragment of a story just to give the audience a sample of that, because even in this book, you even have a story titled Señor Sánchez, who is about a narrator who's been telling stories in some small plaza in the center of LA. And he's been telling the story over maybe roughly 100 years, because he lives up to 124 years, I believe. And maybe if you know, give us a sample of that kind, so that people can hear the narrative voice that we're talking about.
Sure. That and Senor Sanchez is sort of a in honor of the storyteller, and so I'll read you the very beginning of that story. Senor Sanchez lived a rather nice life in our little pueblo of Dos Cuentos. He sat most days in the plaza by the statue of our pueblo's founder and waited, eyes closed, lips pursed in a constant little hum, with his dog Chucho panting by his side. You see, people came to hear him talk. They paid a few pesos, dropping them noisily into an empty Maxwell House tin that sat between Senor Sanchez and Chucho. With each heavy clank of the coins, Chucho's ratty little ears would pop up, frisky and alert, and Senor Sanchez would smile as he leaned back into his weather-beaten fold-out chair. He held his elegant, unusually small hands draped over the brass head of his cane and laughed, always asking the same question. What is it you want to hear? And the customers would tell him. A sad story, said Senora Cruz, a widow for these last 10 years. A funny joke, offered our priest, Padre Olivas, and he tipped his shaggy head at Senor Sanchez, smiling. One I can tell in my sermon next Sunday. Will I ever find a wife? Asked poor lonely Simon, the carpenter. And then the story goes on and it eventually leads to the storyteller telling his last story and why he needed to tell that last story. And you never really know what that story is, but I won't ruin the ending. But the storyteller plays such a key role in I think in my culture, because it is the communal way that we create culture, and a communal way that we create who we are as people. Very, very few of my stories, I tend not to write these really cerebral, kind of bizarre postmodern pieces where you cannot identify the people, you can't identify the place, you can't identify, what's happening really. I'm not that intellectual, I'm not that cerebral. I'm very much based in the real physicality of storytelling and what stories mean. I remember reading someplace that someone said that the thing that distinguishes us between, distinguishes people from animals is the fact that people can gossip. And the ability to gossip, and gossip actually serves a function. It can be vicious, it can hurt, but gossip also is the passing on of information and skills sometimes, and also warnings about that neighbor who kind of looks at you a little strangely, things like that.
No, definitely. And sorry to interrupt.
Mhm.
I just wanted to, because if I don't say it, I'll forget it. When you were talking, it made me think of that first how to day a flying Mexican, when talking about coffee, because Conchita has this secret way of making coffee, and she and Moises makes a deal with her. He would tell her how the secret to how to levitate, and she in exchange would tell him how to make coffee as her mom had taught her. So there is this element of passing, this element in the storytelling that has to do with orality, in which is deeply rooted in the Latin American tradition and the Chicanx tradition, cultural, that has to do with passing down information from one generation to the next by word of mouth. And it makes sense that these stories have this presence, because I think the voice that we hear in the stories is a voice of presence. It makes it not just the voice and what the story is telling us, but it makes the community feel present. You feel when I'm reading the book, I'm feeling almost like I'm part of one of those listeners who are listening to this voice, and that's really important. That's a really beautiful thing that you do here.
Well, I
Continue.
appreciate
I'm
that.
sorry.
No, I appreciate
I just wanted
that.
to because it reminded me of coffee.
Right, and I'll address the coffee point. So, but we got a little note. Maybe we'll save 10 minutes for the end. So we have a couple more minutes. Do you think that will work for questions?
Okay,
Um,
that's
yeah, one more question, Pat, maybe.
Okay, so let me respond to this question. And coffee, appears a lot in my stories, including in the reference you made. I think the reason why coffee appears so much as sometimes an almost magical beverage is that, you think about how people sit around in the morning, with their loved one having coffee and talking, or people going to a coffee shop and sitting and sharing, their pain over a cup of coffee. It's just part of its beverage. I think it's a very Mexican beverage. It's a beverage that I know I started drinking coffee at a very young age, I think fifth grade. Not strong coffee, but it had a lot of milk in it, café con leche, basically, is what it was. But it's something that I think that helps kind of lubricate the conversation, and it also situates you. My stories are situated in very specific places. People are in the kitchen drinking coffee and talking. People are at Tina's Cafe
right.
drinking coffee. Um, and so that, I think it plays an important role. Do you want to see if there are any questions, or do you have one quick question before we look at the audience questions? How do you want to do this?
I think this. I just saw one question, and I think that has to do with you consider your writing a form of protest, and it actually kind of goes well with one of the questions that I had is like I was going to ask you if you consider yourself a political writer. Not that I mean like you write about politics, but like your
Mhm.
writing, is it political, and how do you define that?
Right. So I think that publishing is a political act, and for a Chicano writer like me, I'm part of a group that for many years had been kept out of the publishing world. And now there are more venues and more places who will publish, like the University of Nevada Press, our lovely publisher, who value what we do. So by centering people who look and sound like me and my family and my community, that's a political statement by itself. Um, yes, I do have some stories that address, as I said, the Trump administration's family separation policy. Um, but I don't, in those stories, say the policy is bad. I simply show what occurs
Mm.
when families are torn apart. I'll let the reader decide what that means. And in many ways, perhaps just the fact that I'm humanizing and making three-dimensional people who are like me in my community, maybe that's a political act in itself, because um, uh, maybe someone's going to read a story like that and think, oh, yeah, these aren't just political footballs. These are people, and these are
Right.
kids.
Mhm.
So,
Thank you both. This has been so interesting and a lot of fun. And I have two questions. Um, I have a lot of questions, but I'm limiting it to these two. It's about your story, The Fabricator.
hmm,
And so this is a man who recreates people exactly from corpses. So, like, we want grandmother sitting on the end of the couch. Can you fabricate her so that we can keep these people in our lives? And so the first question is that a thing? Because that like really creeped me out, honestly.
well, in my story, which takes place in the future, when the Mexican altar or ofrendas are just too archaic for the future.
Oh,
And I don't mention that specifically, but I'm thinking, okay, what's the next step? And that is to
oh.
actually create artistic renderings models of your loved ones, but people have to pay money for it, and they're very specifically trained artists who do this. They're not allowed to photograph. That actually grew out of something that used to be done back in the 1800s, where they would take portraits of people who have passed away. They would dress them up and pose them. And this is the early days of photography, and you can find some of these images online, and it's I mean, you understand what they were doing, and you understand that they were using a new technology
Right.
to do this.
See, that's fascinating. I'm sorry.
So that's where that came from, and then the ending is a weird twist that's sort of like a Black Mirror or Twilight Zone kind of twist,
Exactly.
which I will not divulge.
Well, let me ask my question, and if you refuse to answer, so be it. But the quote at the end, which I'm not gonna try it in Spanish, but it translates to "love takes away hunger." And there are times when I'm reading books from different cultures, like I read Russian novels and African novels and English novels all over, and I come across something and it's like, oh, that's like a cultural thing that I'm missing somewhere. And I got that feeling with this because I didn't see how it sort of tied in with the rest of the story. And I wondered if there was something cultural that I was missing. And it turns out I was missing like a huge cultural thing from the whole. I never even occurred to me that it was sort of a next level Day of the Dead sort of thing. But anyway, so that's the question. It's what is the significance of that quote?
Well, basically, the people who are asking for the fabricator to create an image of their loved one, and they're trying to fill a void, and in truth, what they should be doing is just remembering the love that they had for that person who had passed away. That really is the way you honor and remember and can be sustained with the passing of someone you have loved. Trying to recreate them in a model, in the end, doesn't do it. And in fact, some people have seen their younger selves, who are idealistic and true artists, pass from this world and taken over by a more cynical, older version. And that's the key to that ending.
Oh, wow. See,
So
I totally didn't get any of that. So I'll have to reread
that's
the
okay.
story.
Reread it now.
Yeah.
And I always respect my audience, and I will give my all to my stories. And sometimes they'll click with people and sometimes not. And sometimes they won't click until you read them a couple of times. And sometimes they click if you have the conversation that we're having right now,
Right.
which is perfectly fine. And I think I know Leona and I talked about this the other day, that that having a living author talk about a book kind of is a cool thing, because then it gives more meaning, in a sense, to the work when you get to the work.
Absolutely. I was like, oh my God, I can actually ask him, because all these other novels, I'm just like, well, it's probably cultural, who knows?
And guess what? Real fast. I usually do not, when I'm writing a story, I do not connect the dots until the story is done. And then I think about what I've just done, and I see where the dots are. And then the dots really get connected when I have conversations with readers. And when they say that meant this, and I think, oh my God, they're right. Because I use dream logic. I use a lot of dream logic in my writing, and that is way back here. That's in the reptilian cortex,
Right.
way back here. So I don't often know exactly what my stories mean until later.
And that's one of the most interesting stories. And even if you don't get the the reference or how it's connected to the overall narrative, I think it's a story that anybody can enjoy,
Oh,
just because
absolutely.
it's kind of like weird and interesting at the same time.
Oh yeah, it was very provocative, and we are running out of time, and I could go on this conversation for a really long time. Thank you so much again. Really appreciate you being here and being open and sharing. And we are going to move into the closing, so you can turn off your cameras if you'd like.
Okay.
Just so much appreciation for you being here.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone watching. I see all these wonderful notes. I can't write back to everybody, but I see you. I see friends and people I've never met before. I appreciate it, and family.
Thank
too.
you, everyone, for inviting me to interview
Yeah.
such a wonderful writer. Like I said at the beginning, I'm honored, and I'm so happy to have done this interview. I applaud Danielle for writing such a wonderful work.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Leon.
Good
Thank you
night.
for your thoughtfulness. I really appreciate.
Yeah, so the rest of you can stay on because we've got more information about things that are coming up. So thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
There's a link in the chat that will take you directly to the Books Inc. link, where you can purchase this great book and read the stories for yourself. The Spanish language version is coming out soon, so if you want to wait for that, it should be here shortly. Let's see, I've got that. Okay, and a reminder to consider a donation to the Friends of the Alameda Free Library at alamedafriends.com, all one word, and then .com, or through the link posted in the chat. It will help us continue to produce events like this one. If you have friends who you think would be interested in this talk, we'll post it on YouTube in a couple of days, also at alamedafriends.com. Up next, Friends at Home will be hosting a docent talk on underrepresented art stories, led by John Engine, a docent at the Phoenix Art Museum. It's going to be Wednesday, February 8th at 7. The next week, we are going to have our next author talk. I will be interviewing Mary Alice Daniel, whose biography, A Coastline is an Immeasurable Thing, talks about her nomadic life across 3 continents, starting in Nigeria and ending up in LA. Please join us for these free talks. You must register, but the talks, as always, are free. I would like to thank our team that makes these events happen. David Beal, our intrepid leader, Karen Manuel, Karen Romer, Renisha Robinson, Kumar Fons, Karen Butter, Kathleen Adcox, Billy Reisenschmidt, and Becky Sear. And again, thank you to Danielle and Leon for an informative and entertaining program. And finally, thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. Good night.